Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment from one of my favorite correspondents on this show. The mighty Alexander Mikaberidze is back in the house for another installment of Russia Fun. It's become a running joke that I make his ears burn with my profuse but justified praise for the guy, and I'm not about to break tradition because it's just becoming funny at this point. If you haven't become familiar with Alex's work, then you need to crawl out from underneath whichever rock you've been hiding on, because believe me, you will find yourself emerging into the light. That is The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, and Kutuzov, A Life in War and Peace. Two fantastic books that you need to add to your bookshelf. Otherwise, you will find people questioning whether or not you're a respectable Napoleonic nerd, people. His day job is being Professor of History and Ruth Herring Noel Endowed Chair for the James Smith Noel Collection at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. That is a hell of a tongue twister of a title. But Alex is back from what was hopefully a triumphant European tour. I don't believe any annexation of territory was involved in said tour. So, clearly not following the Napoleonic model in that respect. Alex, great to see you again, my friend. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. It's always a joy to be back on your podcast, and I guess I'm doing something right that you keep asking me to come back.
Is this guy for real? I guess
Yeah,
I'm doing something
yeah,
right, says the
yeah.
guy who's like the Don of Napoleonic history these days.
Oh, is it? Oh man, no. Again, I always enjoy talking to you, and I follow your episodes, your discussions, and most importantly, I follow your wonderful, I guess, video tours of the battlefields. I really enjoy the recent postings that you've done on your social media is really fascinating. I've never been to Spain or Portugal, but every time I watch what you post, and they get higher and higher on my list of places
Well,
to
if
go.
you need a guide, I'm
Yeah,
available. What can I say?
you're asking
Um,
for a friend, right?
yeah, absolutely. Um, Yeah, no, thank you. That's very kind. But genuinely, it's a pleasure to have you on and to be getting back to a bit of Russian history. It's nice to talk about a time when Russia was more interested in working with European powers than it is at present, it would seem. Now we're going to go to a time that and an individual today that I am grossly ignorant of. I've seen bits of the docudrama The Great, which I look at and think, there must be a huge amount of fabrication going on there. We're going to look at Catherine the Great, a really interesting, I would say, dominant figure certainly in Russian history, but also I would say in European history. But I must admit, I'm not familiar with her life, her legacy. I had to write some pretty basic questions for this one. I'm going to be honest. Shall we start with popular perception? I think I like doing sort of popular memory things. And I think particularly at the moment, it's very topical given that we're going to be talking a lot about Napoleonic history in popular consciousness with that Napoleon film incoming. So, in terms of the popular perception of Catherine, what would you say is the consensus, if there is one?
Um, in Russia or in the West, because
That's true. They're two
that
very different things. Shall we go with both? Let's be greedy and go with
yeah,
both.
let's I think in many respects, her standing in Russia is as high as it ever was. You probably followed the news of Russian troops stealing the body of Potemkin from Kherson just last year. And of course, Potemkin would have been nobody without Catherine, and many, if not all of the things that he was credited for and remembered for, of course, the result of his relationship with Catherine. For Russia, Catherine marks the moment when I think Russia truly becomes a European power. Right? It has been, the country has been on that trajectory since Peter the Great, but at no point until then, until Catherine comes to power, at no point was Russia as integrated within the largest system of European powers and played such a prominent role as in during those 34 years that she was in power. And what Catherine did is there is a famous expression that Peter opened the window to Europe, right? They kind of cut out the window to Europe. Well, she turned that window into a whole, into a passageway, right? That allowed Europe, both Russia to interact with Europe and borrow many things, cultural, political, economic, philosophical, and become truly westernized, right? Or at least on the elite level. And in that sense, what I see happening today is, in the last certainly 2 decades, but especially in the last 2 years, is the reverse process, where that passageway essentially is closed. We might have a small opening left, but that westernization trajectory that Peter envisioned, that Catherine pursued, is largely undone by the current regime in Russia. And that is why it's such an interesting point to kind of examine, is that Putin has long been using history as a way of propping up his regime, right? This is the narrative of reviving the Russian glory, reviving the Russian standing, the quest for respect. And in this narrative, Catherine plays an outsized role. She is responsible for the rapid expansion of the Russian imperial power. Today, I hope we'll have time to talk about the partitions of Poland, the Russo-Turkish wars, the Russian expansion to Caucasus, that really add enormous territory, enormous kind of respect and international respect to Russian Empire. But on the other hand, so that's one of the angles that current Russian government is so keen on exploiting. But at the same time, Catherine is that westernizing figure, right? The figure that pursued the course that is so different from the one that Putin is pursuing today. As for Western perception, I think they are a bit more kind of measured. We usually, right, in American academia, we usually place Catherine within the cohort of enlightened despots who understand the part of her that is Western, that is enlightened, that is pursued, that wants to bring about measured reforms and kind of modernization to Russia. But we also are very cognizant of the things that she's done that are quite despotic, that are reflective of the political system that she found in Russia. Think about the bloody suppression of the Yemelyan Pugachev's uprising in 1770s. Think about the repression that follows that, or the persecution of the free thinking, whether this is the Freemasons of Novikov or the free thinking of Alexander Radishev, who will be all dismantled, these groups of people and their leaders exiled, and their writings confiscated and burned. So I think from the Western perspective, she is a problematic figure, both for her imperial conquests and for this mixture of legacy that she left behind in Russia.
Yeah, I think that's true of all significant historical figures, isn't it? Very few people come out of the washing machine of history without a hugely complex legacy.
It will be quite disappointing if they came out squiggly clean or squiggly just dirty, right?
Exactly. I mean, this is the point that I find myself emphasizing a lot, that if you start to emphasize all of the good, all of the bad, at the neglect of the other, then actually what you end up doing is stripping people of their human nature, because everybody's got some good and some bad, just in varying levels within them. And not to harp on again about the Napoleon trailer, but I think the trailer is going to be interesting. I know you have views on on some of the depiction of Austerlitz. I think is something that we might save for another time. in that
Well, I
trailer
watched the
because
episode where you were discussing trailers, so I think you covered much of it there.
indeed, indeed.
But
And
I
it's
think for the Catherine, one of the interesting aspects of how she's perceived is the fact that she's a woman.
yes,
She's a woman in a overly masculine world. Russia has a kind of unique position in the 18th century. I think as a power, as a monarchy that for a large stretch of its history in the 18th century, women ruled. Right? We talk about Catherine the First in the beginning in 1720s. Then we have Anna in 1730s, Elizabeth in 1740s, and then Catherine the Second, who takes over in 1762 and leads the nation or the empire for 34 long years. And of those women, I think Catherine has the biggest, notoriety. But and we all are aware of the rumors that were floating around her. Partly it's because again she's a woman in this in this very masculine world. Partly it's because yes, she had lovers and she was famous for that. I think some of the things that were written about her were written clearly from a kind of scandalous point of view, exploring her amorous liaisons on which she embarked in search of this supposedly elusive personal fulfillment. And so some of it is very kind of risque, so to speak, right? But when Russian historian, and this is 19th century historian, Vasily Bilbasov, decided to embark on writing kind of a biographical study of Catherine, he actually was stunned to discover how much was written on her, and he produced a bibliographical volume, kind of listing all the things that were written about her that took about hundreds of pages to fill. And then upon kind of studying this existing narrative, he said, well, let me add a bit more. So he wrote 1,000 pages on Catherine's first half of Catherine's life before she got to the position where she was engaged in liaisons. And that's when Alexander III in 1880s actually intervened to prevent Bilbasov from revealing some of the more interesting aspects of her personal life. But I think what we see is Catherine is very well studied. So there are many aspects of her life that has been examined to excruciating detail, and some of the listeners, if they're interested in pursuing a kind of study of Catherine or reading up on her, I might suggest either the big fat volume by Massey, who is that is quite exhaustive, or the great series of books written on her and Potemkin by my friend Simon Sibak Montefiore. Very accessible, very kind of enjoyable to read. But there are many other biographies, kind of specific studies of her policies, campaigns. So overall, she is probably among the most studied of the Russian statesmen.
Okay, let's start with digging into her story then, and inevitably go back to the beginning and her early life. She's not Russian, is a point to make. She's fundamentally German in terms of her origins. So talk us through where she comes from, and also, are there any indications in her character that she has some sort of resolve that's going to lead to her becoming a dominant figure in Russian history? We do a lot about talking about Napoleon and early indicators that might have caused people to realize that he had certain aspects of his personality that would have enabled him to capitalize. Do we have an equivalent when it comes to Catherine?
I'm not sure about Napoleon's early personality. Hold on a second. No, I don't think. Again, that's a great question in the sense of kind of contemplating what these people would have been able to accomplish if not for those twists and turns of life. For me, I think the beginning, right? If you go all the way to beginning, there's nothing to suggest that she would be anywhere in Russia to start with, not to mention that she'll be at the helm of the empire, because she's born far, far removed from the walls of Kremlin. You already alluded to it, Zach, that she's not Russian. She is German, and she, of course, has a different name, even a last name when she's born, right? She's Sophie August Friedrich of Anhalt-Zerbst. She was born in a small merchant house, actually on the that used to be nestled kind of in the shadow of a small church of Holy Virgin in the city of Stettin, which is today in Poland, Szczecin. The house where she was born, the small actual merchant's house, was a temporary place or temporary residence where her family lived, because her father, Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, was stationed because he was in employment of the King of Prussia, and was kind of moved around to wherever the military needs arose. And this is actually, so she's born in 1729, right? She's born in 1729, and at that time, for those Prussophiles who are listening, this is the period of Frederick William I of Prussia, probably the famous soldier king of Prussia, the predecessor of Frederick the Great, who would be the great rival of Catherine. So she's born in the early hours of May 2nd. Of 1729. If you check Russian studies, you'll see that the date is slightly different. So they would cite 21st of April because of that calendar difference. Russia using Julian calendar until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And I think in many respects, kind of go back to that question you posed, whether she had whether there were any indications. To me, whether you deal with Napoleon, Catherine, or any other figure, I think in many respects, there's the role of luck from the day one that they are born, because we know that disease and death make no distinction between the cradles of rich and poor. There was a fascinating study that was done a few years back, looking at the children of the ruling families. And I think the study concluded that 29 out of every 1,000 infants born into ruling families, so these are not babies from the common stock, but 29 out of every 1,000 infants born into the monarchical families were stillborn. Another 47 died within a week, and another, I think, 110 or so died before they were able to celebrate their first birthday. So in many respects, these children are fortunate to pass 1-year milestone, 5th-year milestone, and kind of grow out, because we forget how destructive these diseases could be. These diseases that we take for granted, things like measles, things like smallpox. I mean, smallpox alone claimed hundreds of thousands. I think there's a recent study that says that as many as 500,000 lives were claimed by smallpox in Europe every year. And Catherine, interestingly, later on would be among the first to inoculate, right, to vaccinate. Let's use this popular term, to vaccinate herself. But technically, she inoculated herself against the smallpox, and she had a conversation with Frederick, this written conversation, and she mentions how her entire childhood was overshadowed by the fear of this disease, because it was lurking everywhere around her. And so one thing to bear in mind is, when we talk about this, were they destined? Well, no, they were not, because they could have just contracted a cut that would have been would have festered and turned into something more serious, or they would have had something like smallpox and died. But I think Catherine was lucky in that she had a tiger mom. And that's an American expression, so I don't know if our British listeners would know it, but she had a go-getter mother, mother who was, in many respects, unhappy with the station, that she held in life. Yes, she's married to Christian August, the prince and employment of the Prussian king, but her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, wanted something more. Right? She felt that she was missing out on life, that the marriage for her was kind of a step down. And whatever Johanna Elizabeth failed to kind of see it or accomplish in her life, I think she wanted to accomplish through her daughter. And it is largely because of her mom that Catherine will be able to accomplish so much in the first, I think, quarter, let's say, first quarter of her life, because it's her mom who makes the necessary connections. It's her mom who lobbies the interest of her daughter. It's her mom that pushes and talks and writes and pesters and annoys people in many respects. But it is because of that effort that this young Sophie, right, before she becomes Catherine, really registers on the horizon, this kind of in the discussions of the great imperial powers like the Russian powers. Because think how many young German princesses from minor families like Anhalt-Zerbst. I would challenge any of you to find Anhalt-Zerbst on the map of Germany, right? But there would have many others like her who would have had this great aspirations to marry well. But in the role of a mother in Catherine's life is quite decisive. And so ultimately, because of her mother's efforts, she will be chosen, right, as the prospective bride for the crown prince of Holstein, well, for the prince of or the Duke of Holstein-Schleswig, who happens to be the successor to the Russian throne.
Is there any sense that I mean, tiger mums are fantastic, and I say that having been raised by a tiger mum. But is there any sense that where Catherine's mother is pushing so hard that ends up being an overbearing influence for her, and does that lead to friction and a slightly fractious relationship?
Oh yeah,
or actually,
oh yeah. Oh yes, I mean, ultimately, if I'm not mistaken, she will be kicked out of Russia because of her pushing and annoying people, and it certainly didn't help that she was, shall we say, kind of a Prussian agent, and certainly in purveyor of Prussian interests. So no, her mom, I think overall she is decisive in terms of pushing her daughter into this position of power, but there's a downside to having such an overbearing parent.
indeed. And when it comes to the relationship with her husband, initially all is not well. I mean, as I was writing this, so I typed out the word. She doesn't initially take to her husband, and then I kind of thought, but does she ever take to her husband? That's a highly debatable concept. So I chucked that in the question as well. How, irrespective of that fact, she does try hard, doesn't she? And that's what really struck me, sort of doing the basic reading for this episode, that she absolutely makes the effort to integrate herself within the family that she's become a part of.
Man, well, here's the problem: is your listeners can just simply Google Peter's portrait and look at him. And yes, I know we should not be judging book by its cover, but there are some books that just ask for it. And then while they do that, I encourage them to Google the portrait of Alexei Razumovsky. This and the juxtaposition will be just stunning. And the reason I'm asking you that is that because Catherine arrived in St. Petersburg, right, kind of at the invitation of the ruling empress, but with the understanding that there will be something big coming out of it in January of 1744. Okay. And right away, when she introduced to Peter, I mean, it's not working out. Peter is an infantile, is kind of person. He has this balanced kind of character, temperament that is prone to outbursts, to kind of unexpected outbursts. He has this kind of preoccupation or fascination with hunting and dogs, and he spent more time with his dogs than really courting Catherine. And it didn't help that their first meeting was when I think Peter kind of burst into her room unannounced. Well, technically it was her mother's room, unannounced, and kind of surprised them. So it's kind of from the very beginning, the relationship didn't work out. And it certainly didn't help that on Peter's birthday, Sophia caught the first sight of that Alexei Razumovsky. So imagine from her point of view, right? And this is 1740s, right? So she is born in 1729. Remember, she's a young girl. She kind of a teenager, kind of transitioning into womanhood, and she's giving a kind of a clear vision that this loser that you just met, right, who's more interested about the dogs, is going to be probably your husband. And then she looks around and she sees, as she described later on in her memoirs, one of the most handsomest men I have ever seen standing right there. Razumovsky was tall, kind of nice body, great voice, great face, kind of outgoing. Yes, he started his career as really at the bottom of the social pyramid. He was one of the servants of Empress Elizabeth in 1730s, chosen largely because he had a wonderful singing voice. By the way, he's from Ukraine. I should mention that. Even though later on a throat infection ruined his voice, he still was clearly a capable guy who could play on a Ukrainian version of a mandolin, who could dance, and clearly was very, very good in bed, because that transition from being a singer entertainer to being the imperial lover will happen soon enough. So from Catherine's point of view, her husband had none of the advantages, none of the things that others had. If anything, Peter, by his behavior, sabotaged his own kind of relationship with Catherine. I do want to mention one more thing, and that is that her mother almost sabotaged Catherine's chances of marrying the Russian crown prince, or technically the Grand Duke, as the Russian heirs are known for, because at every court, the issue of marriage is of national security. It's a political issue, right? Because of the inordinate role that the monarchs played in the lives of these states. So whoever is the mother is of tremendous political importance. And so in Russian, or the mother or wife, right? So in Russia, you had this pro kind of special factions. So you had a pro-French faction, you had a pro-Prussian faction. And Johanna Elizabeth, Catherine's mother, through her behavior, through her assertiveness, through kind of pushing and pastoring, actually did a lot of damage to the pro-Prussian party and to the chances that Catherine had of marrying, much to the delight of pro-French and pro-Austrian factions. And in many respects, it's one of those rolls of luck that Elizabeth and Empress Elizabeth did not cancel plans for Sophie's wedding to Peter, even though she would ultimately, kick out her mother out of the country. This is the moment where I think Sophie, this young girl, and again, I would remind you that she is what now we consider a teenager. She would have been in high school in the United States at this time. But she already makes these very adult choices, how she behaves, how she positions herself, how she sells herself in order to convince the empress that she's suitable to become the wife of the future emperor, to convince her prospective husband, and to convince the nobles at the court that yes, they can see her as an empress. And to do that, she has to undergo a transformation of her identity, a transformation of her personality. And just think what that entails, right? If you spend 16, 17, 18 years of your life constructing one set of identity, a German-speaking, Lutheran, based on whatever the kind of shared values of the German society is, and now you move to a foreign place, and you realize that in order to succeed in that place, you have to slowly deconstruct what you already have, and build a new identity. So to do that, she starts learning Russian language. She starts taking lessons in Russian Orthodox theology. In fact, she will convert from Lutheranism to Orthodoxy, as it was required for any wife of a Russian ruler. And as part of that conversion, she had to take a new name. And I think that in itself is a sign or kind of a symbol of that construction of a new identity that she's engaged in. Once in Orthodoxy, you have a given name, and still, right? You have a given name and you have a baptismal name. So in this case, Sophie Auguste Frederick is her given name, but once she converts to Orthodox Christianity, she became Catherine or Ekaterina Alexeyevna, a name chosen by Elizabeth, Empress Elizabeth, in honor of her own mother, Catherine I, which is a separate and no less interesting story of kind of the trajectory of the first Catherine's life. And so if we look at library that Catherine at this time had, then you see, I think there was a study done on the library, and there is about 800 books that she has, or she brought and she has. And that in itself is quite a statement, right? It's quite a statement, because here is a young girl who has a sizable library. I think many will struggle to find a library of that size in current households. So about 800 books. Most of them are in German. There is a sizable chunk in Latin and Greek, which is interesting itself. And then there is a growing section of Russian books, so which kind of points to her deliberate choice to embrace this new culture, which would have been, in many respects, quite alien to what, or quite different, quite foreign to what she was accustomed growing up. But she would dedicate herself to studying Russian literature, Russian language, Russian culture. And in that, she would become more Russified than her own husband. And I think if I can ask for one more kind of minute, her husband in that is completely opposite to her. Completely opposite to her. Like Catherine, Peter, her prospective husband, was an outsider. He was born also in Germany. He actually was born in the city of Kiel, in what was then the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp. His parents, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, Karl Frederick, and his mother is Russian. She's Grand Duchess Anna Petrovna. So his mother was the eldest daughter of Emperor Peter the Great. But she married a German duke, so her son was born in Germany, raised, and because her sister Elizabeth had no children, right? Elizabeth ultimately decided to essentially leave the throne to her nephew. But much of his childhood, early life, Peter spent in Germany. So in that sense, his identity, right, was also built as a German identity, and to be precise, Holstein-Gottorpian identity, right? And it is only later, right, later in his childhood, I think by the time he is 14, that he will settle in St. Petersburg and start being exposed to the Russian culture. He will be converted to Orthodoxy again. Remember, he was also born as a Lutheran German. Actually, his original name is Karl Peter Ulrich, but later on, when he's converted to Orthodoxy, he will take the name of Peter. But he, unlike his wife, he never really embraced that Russian way of life, right? And I'm using the quotation. Right? He liked that German side of him, and he kind of looked at Russia as a foreign place in many respects. So, speaking of that smallpox, right? Unlike his wife, Peter contracted smallpox. He survived it, but it left him disformed. Certainly, his face has that pock marks, and many of the contemporaries remarked that they kind of what they refer to as the hideousness of his looks because of the smallpox impact. Much of what we kind of think of Peter comes from his wife's narrative, or the narrative she crafted after coming to power. Her memoirs are scathing about Peter. She describes him as an idiot, as a drunk. Actually, at one point, she refers to him as a drunkard from Holstein. She refers to him as a child husband, kind of to refer to that kind of infantile nature of him. She had a problem that Peter was obsessed about all things Prussian. There's a famous scene when Peter was walking around with a bust of Frederick, which is ridiculous and it's quite interesting in itself. He had this penchant for vulgar, I would even say brutal jokes. That he would say it, everyone will kind of laugh with an awkward laugh because the Grand Duke, or later on Emperor, says it, but everyone knew that it was not funny. He had the penchant for practical jokes and physical practical jokes, where he would actually kind of like slapstick comedy, right? He would slap people around, finding it personally funny and amusing, but certainly not for others. His tastes, Catherine said, and I think many contemporaries agreed with her, his tastes were more kind of base and pedestrian, with a great preoccupation towards uniforms, drills, kind of passion for buttons to be in the right order, for raids to be immaculate. But that in itself is not a problem, right? We all love uniforms and toy soldiers, and I'm looking at some people here in the audience.
This is recorded with a green room attached to it. So unusually, this episode has some fans of the show within it. Details on how you can gain that perk, go to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars, #shameless plug. But yes, we're a bunch of Napoleonic nerds here who like to look at a uniform from time to time. All of us have, even I have, looked at Murat on occasions and gone, the guy knew how to dress himself, So there you go.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that, on Murat for sure. I think much of what I've just said, as I pointed out in the beginning, comes from an anti-Peter camp. That's a camp led by his own wife. So there's a lot of things that we need to take with a large grain of salt. There's certain truth in this. Yes, he was less cultured than probably many people would have wanted it. And he's, those jokes and practical jokes that he didn't earn him many fans. And yes, he preferred to be surrounded by Holsteinians, by people that he grew up and was more familiar with than Russians. And that was, I think, a major problem. But to counter Catherine's narrative, I think we need to bear in mind that Peter, in the short reign, right? He only reigned 6 months. During that short reign, we see the kernels or the seeds of what he could have accomplished, and it shows him as, I think, an enlightened despot. So we see, or at least I see in him, yes, sarcasm, yes, cynicism, but also frankness, also a desire to pursue reforms, desire to attempt changes that would have benefited Russia in the long term. Right? And maybe we'll touch upon some of that later in this conversation. So I think what I'm asking essentially to think of Peter as at the beginning you pointed out, right, as a complex historical figure, not a caricature that Catherine crafted in order to justify her own actions in 1762.
Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.